Thanks for tuning into Duck Bricks. I'm Chris and welcome to another episode of BIONICLE Fanon Reviews, where I review every single fan-created, canonized BIONICLE model. These are not official sets, but they have officially been accepted into the BIONICLE storyline, whether through contests officially supported by LEGO, or through stuff like the TTV canonization contests, which are currently ongoing and supported by Greg Farshtey, who is, for all intents and purposes, the current story lead of BIONICLE, which is now, of course, a defunct theme. Today we'll be looking at an Order of Mata Nui member named Krakua, and he's very unique and interesting because he is the only Toa of Sonics to appear in physical form. Now we mostly just get descriptions of these side element Toa in written form, so it's really interesting to see an official build be made for one. And before we get started, there are a few things that I want to note. So zooming in on the model here.
So I want to get this out of the way right at the beginning. This piece, which you can see an axle hole going straight through, did not exist when this model was built. This was built around 2004-2005. This piece, however, debuted with a lot of the throwbots in Toa Mata, and of course did exist. You can see there is no axle hole going through. The technique for his legs is actually surprisingly modern for its time, and it was almost too early, because he uses a ball joint attached by two Technic lift arms to create a knee. The problem with this build in particular, you can see right here is his leg. I'm using the modern piece to simulate his knee movement. The official model, however, did not have access to this piece, and instead had to take this piece without an axle hole going through and try to make it work for this model. So they had this piece in right here, they had the axle sticking out of the side, and they had this other beam connected to essentially nothing. So you can see when I actually have the model built as it was built back in 2005. If I twist the leg even slightly, it'll just come off. Is this a con of the model? Now it's kind of a strange case, because if you look at the way that the leg was built, it's very obviously built almost as if this part was in existence. If this through axle part existed, they would almost certainly have used it. So to me personally, I'm not necessarily so certain that this is a con of the model. It's more of a con of the parts just simply not being available to support the kinds of building techniques that this builder was going for.
I'm limited by the technology of my time.
Nowadays, using two Technic lift arms, putting it through this ball joint axle hole, and adhering it on the side here is a very common technique, and it's one that's very sturdy, and it's used a lot by a lot of the BIONICLE mangas out there. I have no doubt in my mind that the builder of this model would almost certainly have used this technique had the piece existed during that time. In fact, he was 1 year too early. And so, will I take it off as a con of this model? Maybe I'll take off like a point, but honestly, it's not as big of a deal to me because anyone who's looking to build this today, there's literally no reason to not use the cross-axle piece. It looks better, there's no axle sticking out of the side. It's more stable, it's not going to fall apart if you move the leg, and it's simply just the standard way to build this model, just as a LEGO toy itself. So, it's not a big con to me. I'll take off like a point mentally for, I guess, poseability in that regard, but again, it's not a big deal, and if this piece was available to the builder, I am certain they would have used it.
But other than that, everything is the same, except you may notice that I am using King K's Great Inorganic Seletu. This was the mask, of course, worn famously by Toa Inika Kongu, but in Kongu's form it was very rubberized and very organic, so the canon mask for this character in story is the Seletu, so I figured what better mask to use than King K's official mask that depicts it in its inorganic form. I think that it really fits this character and model well and makes him stand out a lot, especially compared to a lot of the other BIONICLE characters. The original model just used a dark gray Hau as almost like a placeholder for his actual mask, because in 2005 when this was built, there was no model for the Seletu yet. So that's what it is. I feel that this is a lot more quote-unquote canon than using the dark gray Hau, which was officially in the build. To me, it's a kind of similar situation to Artaka, where you have a build featuring one mask but a canon depiction featuring another. I will always gravitate towards what the actual canon depiction is, which is why I've used the 3D printed mask created by King K right here. And as an aside, if you want to check out a chat I did with King K about the Bionicle community and 3D printing masks, you can check that out in the description below. I also want to take this opportunity to call out what good of a job that King K did translating the organic Kanohi Suletu into the inorganic Kanohi Suletu. You can see that side by side with Toa Kongu here. This is a really great representation of what the mask could have looked like had it not been mutated by the energies of the Red Star for the Toa Indika. So I just want to say, well done to King K. He again has proven himself to be one of the greatest Bionicle 3D modelers out there, and really does a great job of evoking what masks would look like if they were to come out in sets that weren't stylized or organic like this one. So that's really cool to me, I think. It was a very well done job. So now we can briefly move into the story behind Toa Krakua's character. He originally started out as a mere servant of the Order of Mata Nui. He was just a simple Toa who was kind of going out and doing tasks for the organization. However, with the coming war approaching, with Makuta taking over the Great Spirit's body, he was kind of promoted to full-on member of the Order of Mata Nui. From there, he was instrumental in assisting the main characters like Axon, Brutaka, and even the Toa Mari in some of the missions that comprise the story serials surrounding Makuta's takeover of the Great Spirit. Krakua famously used his sonic powers to awaken a swarm of Borok who battled Rakshi on the surface of Metru Nui in one of the coolest demonstrations of the powers of Sonics used in the canon. As of right now, Krakua has immigrated to Spherus Magna because after Makuta was defeated, of course, all of the denizens of the Bionicle Matoran universe kind of migrated over there, and that is kind of where his story ends. There was a point in the story where Vakama was actually given a vision of Krakua in the future. He was a lone defender of a fortress, and he was holding off swarms of enemies. We don't know if that has passed or has yet to pass, but that is kind of in his future. But as of right now, his story is relatively unresolved due to the untimely ending of Bionicle G1, which is unfortunately a bit of a shame, although he did get his moment to shine. But now let's move on to the 4 key points that I'll be using when reviewing this model. We will be starting off with number 1, Poseability. So how well can you get this model into poses, and can you really get it to stand up well, or does it keep falling over like many of the other canon models? Number 2 is building techniques. So did the builder just take parts from sets and throw it together, or did they actually use some unique building techniques when making this? Number 3 is overall aesthetics. Basically, how good does this model look in general? And does it look streamlined? Are there parts that stand out, strange color choices, stuff like that? And number 4 is how well does it fit in the Bionicle universe? So does this make sense as a Toa character? Does it make sense as a servant and later on member of the Order of Mata Nui? And just in general, does his aesthetic jive with the general aesthetic of, say, other Toa around him? Now, of course, the designs of Toa have varied, but you've got, for example, the Toa Mata, the Inika, the Mari, just other Toa that he would be interacting with. Does it make sense that he would fit in with this universe? As such, at the end of this video, I'll be bringing over some examples of Toa sets to put next to him and kind of do some height comparisons and build comparisons to really weigh out that point. But without further ado, let's jump right into the review of Toa Krakua.
Alright, so here is Toa Krakua. We're going to start off with Poseability. So what's interesting about this one is that the Poseability is actually very good, but this is of course including the ball joint with the through axle hole. Without it, it gets a little bit wonky. But you can see that you can move the feet generally pretty well. It's kind of difficult to move it side by side just because of the way that the ball joint is mounted, but quite frankly, in a model like this, it doesn't really need that. You can bend the knee and the leg pretty much in a standard position, which is far better articulation than a lot of the other models have. And the really good thing about this is that it's sturdy. It's not going to fall over and parts aren't going to fall off. You can very quickly and easily get him in a standing pose. The one thing I will say about the way that the legs are mounted to the hips here is that it doesn't really allow for any kind of posability where you sway the legs out. You can see that immediately swaying the legs out has kind of caused the red Technic axle here to become exposed, and you really just have to push it back in order to get that kind of action. So that is a bit of a con, the way that joints are set up, that it kind of restricts motion. He can't really splay his legs out, and really, if you're really just looking at the legal or quote-unquote legal poses that you can fit with the bricks, he really just has to keep his legs pretty much straight or like this, but he cannot twist them like this, or else you're going to start pulling that axle out. So that is a bit of a con there, but it's kind of a minor one, especially because posability is so good compared to a lot of the other Canon models out there. Now, what's really neat about this one is that he has waist articulation. So it's very simple, just a Technic pin that kind of goes into the hips here that you can turn around the entire body. You could do it 360 if you wanted to, but this really allows him to get into some pretty dynamic poses, which are really fun and really cool to use. The one minor downside, I will say, is that the way that the torso is built is very wobbly. So you can very easily kind of get it out of whack. You can see that this piece for the front, the pearl dark gray Throwbot or Technic block piece, as it's called on Bricklink, is very wobbly right here, and the arms as well are quite wobbly, so you can kind of get it into annoyingly out of position poses, but honestly it's not that noticeable. If you look at the model just straight on, you really won't notice that kind of thing, so it's not a huge deal. And then moving on to the head, that is a bit of a downside, that the head you can only turn side to side. He does not actually have ball joint articulation to turn his head up or down, and the way that it was mounted makes me think that you might have actually been able to achieve something like that if you used a socket piece and maybe one of the Metru heads instead. He probably could have gotten some more head articulation other than side to side here, so honestly, that is a bit disappointing to me, although for most poses, he does pretty well with just the one head moving side to side. It's not like he necessarily needs to, and again, it's a step up from original Toa Mata not being able to move their heads at all, but I can't help but feel there was something more that they could have done to allow him to pose his head just a little bit better. Moving on from the head, we can now take a look at his arms. So his arms are built very interestingly. They're very Technic based, and you can see all sorts of Technic pins and axles around here, but of course he just has the standard ball joint movement for his upper arm. What's interesting about the lower arm is that it's really just a hand that's kind of using a slightly illegal connection right here, and yes, I'm aware that the Toa Kaida used this connection in, I guess those are official LEGO builds. I still think it's a little bit illegal just to strain the pieces like this. Of course, LEGO would never do a connection like this today, but I've seen this used in tons and tons of mocks. Mockists love to use this connection to really just get pretty much a perfect elbow or knee out of it. You could really use this connection here. Is it legal? Maybe, because LEGO's officially use it in combo models, but it's not something I'd recommend. It kind of strains the pieces, but that is what it is. The unfortunate side effect is that because I'm worried about breaking my pieces, I don't want to bend the arm too much, and you can't really bend it past this angle anyway, so it is restricted a little bit in terms of posability. And in terms of the hand, it's basically just the standard Mata hand, which is kind of mounted on a ball joint of its own, which I actually do really like. We'll get back to this when we go to how well it fits in the BIONICLE universe, but using the Toa Mata hand is pretty perfect to me, and I can really feel that this build in general was really trying to evoke the Toa Mata, at least aesthetic and overall proportions, which I think giving the Toa Mata articulated elbows and knees and even a waist, this does it pretty well and actually does stick to the proportions. But back to posability, there isn't really anything else much that you can do here outside of, again, he's able to kind of angle his sword back and forth. He uses an interesting technique for the sword, and this is kind of moving into building techniques now, where it's very simple. It's just a Technic hose piece on a very long axle, and some people like this, some people don't. To me, I think it makes total sense as a Toa of Sonics. His sword, for some reason, the ribs along this Technic hose feel like it's a Sonics type weapon, like it would be vibrating when he hits something. I don't know, I think that this piece just really works well for a Toa of Sonics, and yeah, while the end of it is just a little bit weird with a clear Technic axle and just kind of flatted off there, so it's not really a sword, it's just a tube. I can kind of excuse that because as a Toa of Sonics, it does kind of make sense to me that his sword would be pretty unique. It's not just going to be a standard sword like a metal sword with a sharp edge. It's gonna have some unique detailing, and given that of course this is a fan-created model, there weren't any official pieces made for this, I think this is the closest you could get to a Toa of Sonics sword by using existing pieces, and the use of that Technic hose is actually a really smart move. The one thing that is, however, a little bit strange to me is the way that the upper arm is built. You'll notice here it's kind of wobbly, and the reason for that is that because this whole part is only attached by this tiny end of a Technic axle here. And I really feel like this is where they were feeling the limitations of the building system, where they just simply couldn't get any piece that could attach to a ball joint and also attach another standard Bionicle hand here without having to have these axles sticking out, which quite frankly look a little bit awkward. They don't really add to the detailing to me, and for me personally, I feel like the look that they were going for is, let's say if we were to remove these pieces here, I'm guessing that they wanted to be able to attach it just like this and have his arm be very streamlined like so, but you can't really do that with the pieces that were available during its time, so they kind of had to say, okay, well, maybe if we attach an Technic axle that sticks out all the way here, then we can get one of these Technic pins and put it in like so, but then you've got this piece sticking out and it looks kind of awkward, and that's kind of what you get with this kind of Technic heavy build. I am not a huge fan of the way that these kind of jut out. It's very clear that you're just sticking this piece on by a Technic axle's just back end here, and that also kind of does destabilize it a little bit. You can see, again, it's very wobbly here around the arm. It feels like the arm's going to come off. It won't actually come off because Technic axles are pretty hardy and sturdy, but it kind of feels like that, and it just doesn't feel like something LEGO would ever do in an official set, which is a little bit of a con. Some things that I do like, however, are the use of, say, the Metru foot as a back piece here. I think that it kind of fits the shaping very well. It acts as a really great armor piece, and it does make a lot of sense to me to use something like that. That being said, there are a lot of exposed Technic axles in the back here, and if you were to look at this model from the back, he has all sorts of, let's say, spikes sticking out of the back, like axle here, 2 axles here, 2 axles on the other side, 2 axles on each arm. You get the point. It's just kind of visually incoherent to see so many axles sticking out of the back here, but again, there really was no better way to do this because he was very limited by the parts that he had available to him at that moment, and I'd say for something made in 2005, this is far beyond any of the other mocks in terms of building techniques for a Toa-sized character that I've seen. And then moving on to the building techniques for the legs. Now, I don't really have too many complaints in this regard. This is done pretty well. Again, I had to switch out that piece as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, but if the piece was available, he would undoubtedly have used this piece. So it's not a big deal for me. I like the use of the Toa Mata foot, just very simple, evokes the Toa style. However, there are some limiting factors here. You can see that this piece right here, it kind of hits the Toa Mata foot, and of course that's to bulk up the leg, but sometimes if you're trying to get it into poses, you kind of bend the foot down. You can see the foot can very easily come off because it's just attached by the Mata ball joint, and again, you can't really rotate this side to side all that much because the moment you do, it kind of starts to pull out of the axle. So that is a bit of a con there, and the way that everything else is attached though feels pretty good to me. And I do like the use of the Visorak kind of leg piece right here to use as leg armor. I think that works out very well for a model like this and adds a lot of unique detailing to the rest of his legs. Talking about aesthetics as a whole. So I kind of mentioned that I'm not the biggest fan of the exposed axles, but I do actually really like the color scheme on this one. I think for a Toa of Sonics, there are a multitude of different ways that you could go with it, and the black and metallic gray and dark gray color scheme I feel really works for this. And while some may say it's a pretty simple color scheme, there isn't really anything flashy to make it stand out, I think that the simplicity is actually really good, and it does help the design in terms of feeling very visually cohesive because this looks like a full-on character. Now, the sword, of course, is in a different color, but I feel like that even accentuates it even more and allows you to get it into some really dynamic poses that, say if the sword was pearl dark gray or maybe it was black or something, it wouldn't quite have stood out against the rest of the build. So I am quite impressed with the way that the colors all work together with this model. Of course, the mask used to be just dark gray, not metallic gray. The original HAL was just in dark gray, but I 3D printed King K's mask in kind of this pearl dark gray color to match the chest plate here, and honestly, I think that works even better for this model and makes it look a lot better and a lot more cohesive as well. So there is a plus to that if you are planning on building this model with King K's mask, which is close enough, or the closest you'll get to something that's quote-unquote officially canon. But now that we've covered all 3 points, let's take a step back and compare this model against some other representative samples in the Bionicle universe, and just see how well this model is evaluated as a whole.
Alright, so now we have made it to the final point in the review for Toa Krakua, which is how well does he fit in universe. Of course, he is a Toa model, so I've brought over some representative Toa to compare him against. The first one here is the standard Toa Mata Tahu build. Now, you'll notice that interestingly enough, although I did mention that his design style kind of evokes the same style as a Toa Mata, he is a good bit taller than a Toa Mata. And to me personally, it's not that big of a deal because the Toa Mata are a lot shorter than most of the standard Toa of this universe, just in terms of builds and set-wise, so that's pretty excusable, especially given that the parts that were available during the Toa Mata's time were nothing like the parts available today or even when this was built, so I can kind of excuse the height difference here. The most interesting thing that I found is that he's very similar in height to a Toa Inika, which, of course, it's kind of almost just by great chance because this model came out before the Inika came out on shelves. So, in fact, it actually, I mean, putting him next to Kongu here, who of course also wears the Kanohi Suletu, you can really see that it looks like they both belong relatively in the same universe. Now, I will, however, have to point out a few things here. If we set aside the Toa Mata and Toa Inika right here, the one thing that I do feel that kind of makes this model stand out, and it could be for better or for worse, is the very, very heavily customized and technic structure. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it gives him waist articulation. He has a lot more detailing for a small, compact size with the legs and poseability and whatnot. But then I do feel like you kind of lose out a little bit on the Bionicle aesthetic in general. And what I mean by that is that if you look at this model, try to count how many Bionicle pieces actually are on this one. So you've got the Mata feet, you've got the Vizirac legs, which sure maybe kind of look like they fit in the universe, but even those are kind of more stylized to be more animal-esque. You've got the Toa Metru foot, but only on the back. And you've got the Mata hands, which I do think were a great choice to use. The Mata hands look perfect as a Toa. You could maybe argue that the Throbot Robo-Rider's Technic block piece has been used in some Bionicle sets like Makuta, but it's not a piece that was made for Bionicle. So, all in all, you really only have very few Bionicle pieces on this Bionicle model. Outside of these standard joints that have been used, the regular Bionicle hands, he really doesn't feature any classic Bionicle pieces for any of the limbs. So they've traded that out in terms of the detail, and instead we get a lot of poseability around here, and we get a very nice custom build for the legs. But was that a good trade-off to fit in universe? I'm a little torn on this, because on one hand, I think it's really cool how they have a custom Technic body, custom Technic arms, custom Technic legs, but then I think it veers a little bit too much into Technic and just posable figure in general, and you kind of lose that Bionicle aesthetic a little bit. You can see that you can get this into really wild poses, which is really great, but then at the same time, you never really see another Bionicle set attempting something that looks like this because they simply just don't have the amount of articulation that's needed to do something like this with the waist and the whole Technic angles and whatnot, especially keeping it at a scale like this. So it's a little bit difficult to articulate exactly what I mean by this point, but I guess it all kind of boils down to not enough original Bionicle pieces and just a little bit too much Technic. And I know this might be a controversial point. If you disagree, please let me know in the comments. I'm sure a lot of you will disagree with this. And again, this is just my personal opinion. If you really like the Technic build, then great, that's great for you. I think that you're really gonna enjoy putting this together, whether you like it or not. But that's just kind of how I feel. And that's why I'm giving the believability and fit in the universe a 6 out of 10. Now, it's bolstered again by the Mata hands, the Mata legs. He uses the Toa Metru foot in the back. But then it's taken away a lot because there's just so much Technic clearly visible here that it kind of doesn't feel like a standard Bionicle character. Now, I know a lot of Bionicle Titans used a ton of Technic in their builds, but essentially they still tried to evoke the Bionicle aesthetic by using unique Bionicle pieces for like their legs and their arms and whatnot, and just having some Technic attached around. Here, Technic is used to build basically the entire thing, from the torso to the legs to the arms, and I feel like that kind of makes it stand out, especially, again, if you put them next to Toa Kongu. You can really see the difference in aesthetic here, and it makes it look a little bit strange and out of place. But that's just how I feel about it. You probably feel a different way, or maybe you don't. Let me know if you disagree or agree down in the comments. But now, moving away from believability in the Bionicle world, we will move on to overall aesthetics in general. So this again is, I feel, a bit of a mixed bag. It's far better than a lot of the other models are in terms of aesthetics. It has a cohesive color scheme. It's got really nice color blocking. It generally looks really cool and you can get it into cool positions. That being said, again, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 exposed axles sticking out quite long on the back of the back and arms here. Literally half of a Technic 2-length axle is sticking out. So that feels a little bit strange to me. And if you had used the original technique for the legs, you'd have another axle sticking out here. So I feel like there's a lot of exposed Technic here, and that may or may not be a good thing. Again, if you try to move the legs, kind of display them out, you kind of expose the Technic pieces right here. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag, but it is very cohesive. It has a good color scheme. So I'm gonna have to give this one a 7 out of 10 in terms of aesthetics. It's a very complex build. It's very dense. It's very unique with Technic. I don't know if this kind of build would be accepted into canon nowadays or if it would be voted canon, but it's certainly something that kind of went outside the box and pushed the boundary of what a Bionicle model could be. And for that, that's what I do like about it. And speaking of pushing the boundary, moving on to Poseability. Now, Poseability, I'm going to have to give this one a 9 out of 10. It would have been a 10 out of 10 if you could actually move the head up and down. But since you can only move the head side to side, 9 out of 10, everything else is amazing. You can move the knees, move the feet. Yeah, it kind of comes out a little bit when you try to bend the legs, but I mean, just, it's not that big of a deal. You got waist articulation, you've got some arm articulation here, which obviously doesn't bend all the way, but it bends enough. And yes, there's a ton of nitpicks that I could get into with the Poseability here. Like I mentioned, oh, you can't move the feet too much because it's kind of constricted by the part placement here. Can't move the legs outwards because otherwise it'll pull the axle out. You can't bend this too much, otherwise it's gonna stress the parts. But at the end of the day, it really all boils down to, can you get this into a cool pose? And I think it certainly achieves that. And not only can you get it into a cool pose, you can do so with relative ease and without having to continually fiddle with it too much. Like so, you can see I've put it into a pose in a few seconds, whereas if I was messing with some of the other models, it would take several minutes to even get it to stand up. So maybe I'm just a little bit influenced by the slew of models that I've reviewed in the past that just cannot support their own weight and can't stand up. And maybe it's just refreshing to get a fan-created Bionicle canonized model that can actually support the weight of his weapon, can get into cool poses, really unique and vibrant poses, and not fall over all the time. I think that that's really cool for this model, and something that not a lot of the fan-created models really do. So for that, that's why it gets a 9 out of 10. Maybe I'm being a little bit too nice on it. It could be an 8 out of 10, but that's just kind of how I feel. And the final point here is building techniques. Now, I will say that if you're looking at this model from today's standards, if you were to look at a mock that was built today, if this was built today, there would be a few criticisms, I would say. There would be, oh, you could probably fix the way that the axles stick out here by a different building technique. You could probably come up with a better technique for the elbows here to give it more articulation, so on and so forth. But I'm reviewing this with regard to the fact that it was built in 2005. That was back when models were looking like the Toa Hordika and the Vizirac. You weren't getting anything near the level of detail, posability, and just overall building techniques and skill in any Bionicle set. And I wasn't even seeing it in really any of the fan-created mocks. Most of the Dark Hunters, which were built around the same time frame as this model, were nowhere near the level of sophistication in Technic building that has been kind of showcased in this model. especially the unique torso, which I didn't go into too much detail, but I really love how it kind of really does look like almost like the Toa Mata torso. It's basically proportioned exactly to fit the Toa Mata scale, and it's completely able to articulate. You can bend it all around. It's a completely unique Technic build. I just think that's really cool. And considering the fact that it was built in 2005, this is probably the most technically advanced Bionicle model that I've seen built around that era, maybe in general. So, and for that, I think I'm going to give this one a 9 out of 10 on building techniques. I think it's really great. Could you do it better today? Sure. I mean, the best example of this is the fact that they used the wrong ball joint piece because the better ball joint piece simply didn't exist. So you could do it better today, but for its time, it was one of the most technically advanced models out there that I've seen for Bionicle, especially for anything that's been canonized. And for that, I think that it deserves a high spot on the ranking here in terms of building techniques. But this is just my opinion. We're about done with this review. Let me know what you think of Toa Krakua in the comments below. Do you like this build? Do you think there's too much Technic, or is the amount just right for you? Stay tuned to Duckbricks for even more Bionicle Fanon reviews coming out every week, and stay tuned for even more LEGO news, reviews, discussion, and analyses coming your way very soon. Thank you, and bye-bye for now.